So I'm just about to take up the role of the president of IPDA, following in the esteemed footsteps of the esteemed Graham Donaldson. So I'm delighted to be taking up the role. Organisations that focus on professional practice and organisations who convene practitioners and researchers together in respectful and engaged dialogue. I think we need to promote them, and in the field of education research in particular, conferences that are benign and supportive in tone, that accept abstracts from early career researchers and treat them with respect. I think that's really important and very important for the field of education. So I'm delighted to be the president. I think there's a number of hot topics in professional learning at the moment, particularly when we focus on professional learning from a practitioner perspective. The first one is constantly challenging the very naive view that either policymakers determine or researchers discover and practitioners implement or deliver, and that there's a great divide, and that the job of a policymaker is to write the policy and then it is disseminated to the practitioners, whether that be medical practitioners, education practitioners, social care practitioners, and their job is to just do it. As someone described it as the Nike approach to system change. Focusing on professional learning, particularly from a practitioner perspective, challenges that. I think the other simplicity that a focus on professional learning challenges is the linearity idea. The idea that in fact, and the lack of complexity that as well, that a policy is developed and then it moves through a series of stages. So it's almost slightly more complex than the Nike approach, but it still sees the practitioner as just doing the executive function. We have at Dublin City University, we have thousands of students preparing to teach. And when they go on, and they're all passionate about teaching, and they all talk about having seen inspirational teachers in action and being really inspired by them, and I think that's powerful and we want to sustain it. But when they go on their first placement and they actually have to do the teaching as opposed to just observe it, it comes as quite a shock when they realise how complex it is. Because obviously what they saw, what inspired them, was an expert practitioner who made it look easy, engaging, inspiring. What they never saw was the professional learning behind that, the complex layers of planning that went into it, the preparation, the theoretical framing that the educator might have done. And I think the same goes for any kind of clinical practice. The people who receive it, the observers, think it looks easy, because actually the job of a really good teacher is to make it look like this is not rocket science, whereas when you try to do it, actually it is. So I think one of the hot topics is to constantly challenge the idea that practice is the execution of somebody else's ideas. The second one is to I think, promote the complexity of it, and not just in terms of all the many decisions that have to be made, but also the emotional dimension of practice, the social dimensions of practice, the political dimensions of practice, as we heard at the conference today. So I think there's a need within the field to constantly foreground the complexity and the multi-layered aspects of practice. And then when it comes to professional learning, we have to challenge the idea that the job of that professional learning is about teaching people how to do it right. That in fact, professional learning is about the development of your identity as a professional. And that tension between sometimes the funders of professional learning or the designers of professional learning or the aspirations of those who develop professional learning programs, those aspirations and the aspiration of the professional learner, they don't always meet. And I think finding ways through that tension, those tensions are important. When I think about where practice might be going into the future, I think there's a number of exciting ideas that are worth that are worth pursuing and that are being pursued by researchers in IPDA and in other organisations. One is the idea of practice as being communitarian, and the increasing focus on not just a single practitioner, but on a group of practitioners, people working together. So whether it's not even a community of practice, it's actually it's a collaborative of practice, if you can use that word. Although a word I heard recently was a collaboratory of practice. In other words, where you've a group of people who are involved in practice, and they're not just sharing about or talking about, they're interrogating each other's practice and their own, and coming up with a collaborative view of practice. I think that's very powerful, not just for the practitioners, but if we take education, which is my home discipline, when learners see it in action, when even children, when they realise they're working with 2 or 3 adults in a learning context and not just one, I think it changes how they understand learning, and I think that's going to be very important into the future for all kinds of reasons. So the collaborative dimension, I think, is one. Although it's not a panacea, and I don't mean it means we need to teach people to be more collaborative. I think we need to see practice as collaborative activity. I think a second kind of potential area for further development is to look at some of the emerging ideas of the relationship between theory and practice. You know, the classical kind of debates around where theory sits in practice, and we've had embedded theory, we've had grounded theory, we've had emergent theory. I think within the field of education, there's some really interesting thinking going on about where theory sits, particularly in practice that is digitized, where there's quite a lot of engagement online, for example. So the traditional view of the education practitioner is in a face-to-face setting. But for those whose predominant mode of engagement, and increasingly medicine is moving into online engagement, so for those whose mode of engagement is online and the interaction is quite different in that space, how do we frame that? How do we understand that theoretically? And there's some really interesting work beginning to emerge from that space, and I think that will have implications for how we think about practice, particularly in education, but I think also in medicine in the short to medium term.